everybody, it's Kenneth, and I'm here with Dr. Roger Walsh at the University of California, Irvine. And we were talking a little bit before and wondering what to talk about. And because Dr. Walsh has so many specialties, so many things that he has done work on, I thought it would be interesting, or at least good, to have a top level overview, I guess, of your work, and talking about your life, what brought you to the work that you do, and how A Course in Miracles fits into this building. You know, this is the Department of Medicine, and you're a professor of psychiatry.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe let's start with the course. You know, how did you find the course?
Well, I think it actually found me, as it tends to do. And it found me, as it usually does, through relationship. And in this case, through my wife-to-be, Frances Vaughan, who I met in 1976 and who showed me the course shortly after that. She had just been introduced to it about a year ago. And I took one look at it and saw words like God and Holy Spirit and closed it and said, no, thank you. But then over the next year or so, I kept meeting people who would say very interesting things, and I'd say, oh, that's fascinating. Where'd you get that? And they'd say, from A Course in Miracles. Course in Miracles, okay. And then I had the privilege of being at a talk that Jerry Jampolsky organized for Bill Thetford to give. I think it was the American Psychiatric Association of all places, and I had a chance to listen to him and then to spend some time with him afterwards. And I remember this thought arose, you know, if he's into the course, maybe I should be too. And there was something about him which was very impressive, inspiring, in a quiet and unobtrusive way.
Do you say that because of his credentials, or how he is?
No, it was just his person. It was something about him, his personality, his person, not so much his personality. And I couldn't even say exactly what that is. I'm trying to remember exactly what the thought was that arose. I can't recall the exact thought. It was along the lines of, if he's into the course, I need to take a look at it. So it's just something about him as a person that was inspiring in some way, not in any obtrusive way, not in a highly charismatic way. Bill was a kind of quiet, gentle person, but there was something about him that was impressive. And so then I began looking at it again and struggled with the language for a while and the Christian orientation and terminology, because I'd been pretty much inoculated against Christianity in Sunday school or a long time back. My adolescent agnostic or late adolescent turned to agnosticism. And yet after wrestling with the language for a while, there was a kind of breakthrough after maybe a couple of months where I just began to appreciate the profundity of the material. And then Frances and I have continued to do it for 35 years.
Mm. So before the course, were you already in academia?
Yes, I was very much in academia. Had been, at that stage, I'd just finished my psychiatry training and had a postdoctoral fellowship and had accepted a position here at the University of California. And so I had been very much in academia, doing research and so forth, even as a student. So I was continuing that trajectory.
And were you spiritual at that point? Did you look at spiritual material?
Not until quite recently. At that time, I had been raised in a very conventional, not non-religiously oriented family who shipped me off to Sunday school for as in the conventional mode, and I had some interest in conventional Christianity, a mild interest in my early teens, and then became agnostic, and then radically scientistic, in the meaning that science became my God, and I worshipped at its altars and paid homage to its Nobel laureates, etc., as the saints and sages of that tradition, and basically had a pretty materialistic, reductionistic, scientismic worldview at that stage. But what really shifted my life was when I was raised in Australia, came to the United States after I'd finished medical school and done my internship to do psychiatry training at Stanford University. And California has a way of changing people.
Yes.
There's a norm, this is an extraordinarily fertile area intellectually and spiritually and culturally in many, many ways. An enormous amount of experimentation and openness here, and that was particularly so back in the 70s when I first arrived. And as part of my training, I was doing psychotherapy on people. I didn't really believe it did much useful, but I figured I had a moral obligation to try it myself. So I went into therapy for what I thought would be just a few weeks of maybe interesting self-observation, and staggered out of there about a year and a half, 18 months later, with my world totally turned upside down, having had the extreme good fortune of being in therapy with a man, Jim Bugenthal, who was a humanistic existentialist and a very sensitive human being who was able to train me and others to get in touch with our inner experience. So it's like being hooked up with a human biofeedback machine who could point out modulations of voice or breathing or posture and suggest that, what was happening then, and first I wouldn't have a clue, and I'd gradually begin to realize, oh yes, something did change when you asked that question. And then it was like, oh yes, I noticed this feeling of anxiety that arose in my chest, and it was associated with imagery, and in this image of such and such happening, and these thoughts went with it, and these catastrophic expectations, so forth. So it was like being trained to recognize an inner universe that I really hadn't even known or suspected existed. And
it was making you more aware of yourself.
Yeah,
really.
Very self-aware, but much more psychologically sensitive, and much more aware of the mind and the way it worked, and able to access my own emotional and inner experience. And it felt like I had lived my entire life on the top 6 inches of a wave on top of an ocean I didn't even know existed, and that there was an inner universe as vast and mysterious as the outer, which I hadn't even suspected. And as I looked around the world, it seemed like I wasn't alone, that the vast majority of people were unconscious of this inner universe. And to the extent we were unconscious of it, we were run by it. So therapy led me to the recognition that first there was an inner universe, and second it was possible to learn from it, and third it was possible to develop and cultivate aspects of oneself, one's sensitivity, one's introspection, one's emotional life, one's imaginal life. And that led me to explore a variety of the many other kinds of disciplines and activities that California has to offer. And for a couple of years there, I just dove into almost anything and everything that California had to offer: Eureka, TA, TM, Gestalt, you name it. And eventually found myself drawn towards some groups such as Muktananda and others who were doing chanting and meditation, and I couldn't understand why the heck I was around these religious people, since I had decided that religion was the opiate of the masses, and a primitive relic of archaic ways of thinking and believing. And yet some of these people seem to have something interesting. And so eventually I took up meditation, and as with a lot of people, it was a slow process, and I'm not particularly talented meditatively, so it took me a couple of months before I began to realize that, oh yes, something is happening. I was expecting lights and dramatic experiences, but what actually meditation teaches you to do is to not so much to have necessarily to have dramatically new experiences, though those can certainly happen, but rather to be sensitive to the subtleties and richness within one's present experience. So that convinced me that meditation and contemplative practices had something to offer, but I still couldn't figure out why the heck I was doing these things, given that I still assumed religion was the opiate of the masses and essentially a primitive, archaic leftover.
That was your ego still holding on to that belief system.
Well, I mean, you can put it that way. I don't necessarily, I don't know that it was necessarily a defensive maneuver at that stage. I think it was more, it feels in some ways more a kind of collective ignorance, because there is so little understanding of the true nature of religion in our culture. And for me, there was a dramatic, literally one moment in which my life changed, where there was an insight into the nature of religion. I was literally walking across the living room on the way to get ready for dinner, where in middle of the room, I suddenly had this insight that, oh, the great, hidden behind the conventional structures and rituals of conventional religion are inner technologies for inducing the same states of mind that the founders realized. The same insights, the same states of mind, the same realization, the same qualities of love and compassion and wisdom, etc. And roadmaps for describing reality as it appears to those awakened minds. Yet those inner technologies and roadmaps are pretty much hidden and forgotten in our culture. That is, that conventional religion is more about myth and ritual and belief than so much about inner transformation. And eventually I would come to learn, as Ken Wilber beautifully put it, that they're really two very, very different kinds of religion. There's conventional religion, which centers around a narrative, and the ideal is to believe the narrative, and if you believe the narrative, you're saved, and if you don't, you're in trouble. And if you share a narrative with someone, then they are your brothers and sisters, and if you don't, then they're problematic at least, and maybe historically you would go to war with them, and maybe some days in some situations in our world today that still happens.
Can you just define for us what a narrative is?
A narrative, basically a story. Conventional religion centers around a story that one is expected to believe. God created the world in 6 days, and Jesus is the only Son of God, and you have to believe in him to be saved. Or take your pick. The Buddha was born out from his mother's side and walked immediately and was this superhuman being, and if we just do as he says and follow the rituals, etc., then we can be saved, essentially, maybe. But that's very different from, that's conventional religion, but that's what is technically called mythic, literal mythic, or mythic literal religion. And then there's transconventional or transpersonal religion, which is basically a psychotechnology. It's about training the mind and heart to transform them, to cultivate the qualities and stages of development and states of consciousness that the founders realized, as did the great saints and sages. So they're very, very different kinds of religion. In fact, they're just radically different. In fact, they're different developmental stages. And our culture knows almost nothing about transconventional religion.
Why is that?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons. One is that it can be looked at in terms of the development of individuals and cultures. Another can be looked at in terms of the particular structure and power structure of particularly Western monotheistic religions. In the West, if you take, for example, Christianity, we have particularly in the Catholic Church, a very hierarchical structure which was able to enforce its beliefs, both theologically and politically, and legally up until quite recent historical times. You were required to believe, and if you believe the conventional narrative, and if you didn't, you might end up on a funeral pyre. In fact, we tend to forget how rare it is in human history that we have the opportunity of even practicing other religions and traditions and harboring our own interpretations and views. So one reason why the mythic literal has been the main and very much the main form of religion in Western culture is because of the hierarchical structure of the church, and it was able to enforce a particular level of religion as the norm. And the church has always been suspicious of its mystics, its people at the transconventional level. As has Judaism and Islam. One could very much easily, from this developmental perspective, one could very easily say that Jesus had a transconventional, transpersonal realization, and that was, as it often still is, interpreted as heresy, apostasy, as it does appear to the world, as it appears to the conventional perspective, to say that the Father and I am one. From a transpersonal perspective, is a statement of realization of one's true nature. Mm-hmm. From a conventional perspective, it's the height of hubris and apostasy, and has traditionally been punished by death. Mm. So, Jesus was crucified, as have been put to death, as have been, for example, Socrates, who certainly seemed to have some realization of transpersonal realization. And you can run through each tradition and look at various mystics, Al-Hallaj in the Islamic tradition, a number of the Sufis in Islam, and on in various traditions. It's been a very dangerous occupation to be a mystic and a transpersonal realizer in the West for most of history. Yeah. So that's one reason why the conventional literal mythic has been the dominant level or mode of religious interpretation and experience. The other is individual, that everyone starts life at infancy, and we mature through particular developmental stages. And one of the really exciting developments in psychology of the last few decades is we've begun to be able to map out people's development from infancy into adulthood, where we thought development stopped. And now, just in the last few decades, we realized, oh, wait on, psychological development doesn't have to stop when you're body stops growing. Psychological development, maturation can continue throughout the lifetime. Mm-hmm. And we're just beginning to map out some of the post-conventional developmental stages of, for example, cognition and faith and morality and meaning making. So it's but most people, the reason the conventional level is called conventional is because that's where most people are. All of us come into the world at a pre-conventional level. Then we get socialized, we get inculcated with the cultural beliefs and mores and values and ideas and ideals. And we are pulled up to the conventional level, but culture acts as like a magnet. It pulls people up to the conventional level, but it doesn't help them get beyond the conventional level. If anything, it kind of retards development above the conventional level. And because post-conventional worldviews and values and meaning systems and ethics call into question the conventional myths, and so are seen as a threat, a psychological and spiritual threat to psychological and religious threat anyway to people at the conventional level. So you don't get much help moving beyond those levels. And one of the beauties of the Course and any authentic spiritual tradition is that it offers a training program for helping us move to those post-conventional levels.
I think it's wonderful that you have such a firm grounding in the scientific method and research and in I guess, rational thought. But at the same time, you're obviously a very spiritual person. You have studied these and you practice them in your own life. And sometimes it feels like being an academic, say, is at odds with being a spiritual person. And, very often our image of a spiritual person is I don't know if this is a caricature, but it's a mystic, right? And what I'm finding these days is that it doesn't need to be so. In fact, we need to be both. We need to be both a functional human being capable of doing whatever it is that we need to do, and still be very grounded in profound mystical experiences and traditions. Do you sometimes feel that your intellect gets in the way of your spiritual practice?
Let's see. Certainly. Yes. The intellect is a tool, and depending on how we use it, it can help or hinder. And but maybe before we get into that, maybe Kenny made several interesting points. One is about the varieties of possible lifestyles as a spiritual practitioner, and the other is the role of the intellect. So I would agree with what you're saying about the value of being able to do spiritual practice and yet integrate it into one's daily life and remain in the world. I would just add something you'd probably agree with anyway, and that is that there are a variety of lifestyles, and we obviously need to honor the different callings people have, all the way from recluse and someone living in a cave through to someone living very much in the world. And it's hard enough to know what kind of life is best for yourself, let alone for other people. But I think you're pointing to something very interesting, and that is it does seem that in recent decades, there has been first an infiltration into the West of contemplative and spiritual practices. Mm-hmm. First from the East in the 60s, partly as a result of the psychedelic movement, which opened a lot of people's minds and had some very powerful effects and introduced made it very clear to our culture that the mind was capable of altered states and experiences, both profound, beneficial, and painful, of a far wider and deeper variety than we had ever suspected. And then a number of people, some of them inspired by psychedelics, went to the East, discovered these remarkable practices, meditation, yoga, etc., brought them back to the West. And as a result of that, they've infiltrated through the West and also led to a revival of Western contemplative practices. Jewish Kabbalah, Sufi zikr, Christian contemplation, centering prayer, etc. These are very profound practices that it's wonderful that they're reviving. And so this means that just compared with a few decades ago, there are millions more people doing authentic, effective spiritual practices than previously. You know, not just rituals, not just prayer, you know, which have their place, to be sure. I don't want to put them down, but they may not constitute a full and authentic spiritual path by themselves. And so the fact that we are now living in a time where not just some contemplative practices, but the world's contemplative practices are available to us for the first time is extraordinary, just extraordinary. I mean, this is unprecedented in human history to have the great wisdom of the world, and its practices available. So we now have the opportunity of doing these in daily life. And for some of us, like yourself, like me, that has meant being in the world and trying to use our practice, our daily lives as our spiritual practice, using our work, our activities, our relationships, all as the vehicle and fuel for spiritual growth and maturation and awakening. And sometimes that means being out there as a spiritual figure and teacher, or as you've said, sometimes it means just being very quiet and going about one's work and being quite subtle in one's attempts to help and contribute. So, a long answer to your point.
Could you tell us a bit about the commonalities between the world's contemplative traditions?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time looking at this and feel very fortunate because this really is the first time we've been able to make those kind of comparisons and see what the world's great teachers and teachings and trainings and practices have in common. In fact, I spent 3 years writing a book, Essential Spirituality, the 7 Central Practices, looking at exactly this question. What is it that the wisest people who have lived say are the most important qualities for us to develop, and what practices do they recommend for it? And as I looked across the world's spiritual traditions and practices, it seems to me that there are 7 core practices that the great sages recommend as essential for a full life and for possibly a full spiritual awakening and spiritual maturation. First, they all, and maybe I'll just run through them, then we can go into them in detail if you like. First, they all recommend a foundation in ethics, living ethically. Second, they emphasize the importance of emotional transformation, reducing painful, destructive emotions like fear and anger and jealousy, and cultivating positive emotions like love and joy and compassion. Third, they emphasize the importance of training attention, being able to foster hold concentration instead of the mind jumping all over the place. And of course, the Course emphasizes this too. Then they emphasize training awareness and perception, so that one refines one's perception, one becomes more sensitive to one's experience, one also is able to see things with a spiritual vision effectively, to recognize the sacred in all things. And then they emphasize the cultivation of wisdom, of insight and understanding of reality and ourselves. And all the practices, I'm forgetting one. Let's see, ethics, emotional transformation, attention concentration, perception, wisdom. I'm forgetting one, but anyway, the culminating practice is service and contribution to others. All the other practices funnel into the use of whatever one's gains for the welfare and awakening of everyone.
It's interesting that I didn't hear you mention love.
Well, you did actually, because love is part of emotional transformation. Yeah, that's definitely one of the central emotions. Love, compassion, joy. 3 big emotions that come up. And of course, one of the things you notice is different traditions have different emphases. The Course, is a brilliant intellectual scheme, works with the mind brilliantly, emphasizes work in the world, but it also has a major focus on love. And but the Course is a very well-rounded tradition. It covers a lot of bases.
Now, I know we're preaching to the converted, but what is unique about the Course?
Well, let's see. First, that's a great question. I'm going to have to think that through as we continue the dialogue. But first is that it is a self-contained text. Basically, it's rare to find a whole path contained in one text. Now, of course, people from different traditions might disagree, saying, for example, Islam might say the Quran is sufficient unto itself. Well, maybe so. But it's rare to have a text which not only lays out a thought system, but lays out a series of practices and a families of practices. So the fact that the whole path is contained, at least in seed form, within this single text is remarkable. Second thing is the profundity of the Course, and at the same time its capacity to speak across developmental levels. It clearly is sourced from a profound, in fact, an ultimate source.
When you say developmental, you mean spiritual development?
Yes, but not only spiritual, also psychological development. A good teaching has to be able to. A good teaching is able to communicate in a way that can be heard by people at different psychological and spiritual developmental levels, and that people can gain from it. And clearly, the Course can benefit people from the first time they pick it up, even if they haven't been involved in any other spiritual practice. But it also seems, as with any really profound text, it seems bottomless. And I don't know, I've been going through it for 35 years, and each time I go through it, it's like, oh, where was I the last time I read this? I'm sure you know that experience. So first, it's self-contained in one major volume or set. Second, its profundity and its multi-levels. Third, that it lays out multiple kinds of practices. Perhaps the most useful division into different kinds of practice comes from Hinduism, where they talk about 4 major kinds of yoga. There's there's jnana yoga, which is the yoga of intellect and wise discernment. There's bhakti yoga, which is the yoga of love and devotion. There's Raja Yoga, which is the royal yoga or the yoga of mind training. And there's Karma Yoga, which is the yoga of work and action in the world, using one's work as one's spiritual practice. The Course works with all four, beautifully lays out all four. So that's an interesting feature. One doesn't often find that in a text. And I think people with that's one reason it appeals to so many people, is that, whatever your predilection is, you seem to be working in the world as a way of making your contribution and getting this out there. So you're doing Karma Yoga, but at the same time, you're also, cultivating love. And obviously, you're very smart. You're playing with the intellectual side of it too, etc. So, and anyone who does the lessons is getting some meditative training. So, so the Course is unusually well-rounded in that way. Let's see. Then it has, it's remarkably psychologically sophisticated in some places. There are ideas I've gotten from the Course that I just haven't seen in conventional Western psychology. I will sometimes use these when I'm teaching, or people say, "Oh, that's interesting."
Such as?
Oh, let's see. What are some of the things? Gosh, it seeps in so many subtle ways. Well, one is forgiveness, and another unique feature of the Course is its very sophisticated understanding and teaching about forgiveness. So, it's very useful to be able to talk about the different levels of forgiveness and what forgiveness means at different stages, and the idea that forgiveness is a extremely beneficial practice for the forgiver as well as the forgiven, and that at a deep level there's actually nothing to forgive, that all our perception of, quotes, sin comes from a particular perspectival stance which founded in condemnation. And so that's that's one example. And coming back to the idea of the one unique feature of the Course being its sophisticated psychological understandings and techniques, is its practice of forgiveness. I've not seen anything comparable anywhere. And we tend to forget that Christianity is unique in its emphasis on forgiveness. Jesus really emphasized forgiveness extraordinarily, but more so than in other traditions. Other traditions have it, but it's not as central as it was for Jesus. And the Course clearly follows that lineage, but adds a psychological richness and depth that I've not seen anywhere in any tradition.
Now, you mentioned Jesus, and I'm just going to take the opportunity to ask about Jesus. So, there's this whole thing about, did Jesus write the Course? Who is Jesus? Which Jesus are we talking about? Is this like an ideal Jesus, just as love is Jesus, or is this the Jesus of Nazareth that wrote this book or channeled this book through Helen? What are your thoughts on Jesus writing the Course?
Well, let's back up and talk about who Jesus was. And first off, we should acknowledge that he is perhaps the greatest Rorschach test in our culture, and that people have been debating and killing and dying over different interpretations of who he was and different interpretations of his teaching for almost 2,000 years now. So we need to acknowledge there's no agreement on who or what Jesus was. And we should also add to that a developmental perspective and say it's not just people with different personality types looking at Jesus and coming to different conclusions. It's also people at different developmental stages. And for a person who is, for example, on a spiritual developmental map hasn't even begun, or is, let's say, is atheist or agnostic, Jesus will be maybe a wise man. For someone who has begun, who is a fundamentalist, well, church teaches he is the only Son of God, so end of question. For a person who is opening to spiritual practices, Jesus, and doing contemplative practice, for example, Jesus might be an exemplar of love and compassion. For a person who's done deeper practice, Jesus might be a profoundly realized or awakened or enlightened sage. So we need to realize that not only is there no agreement on who Jesus was, that there's enormous variety of ranges of opinion on who Jesus was, and that comes not only from horizontal or different personality perspectives, but also from different developmental perspectives. And one's view of religion and spirituality and of saints and sages and founders, religious founders like Jesus, changes very dramatically according to people's depth of practice.
What does Jesus mean to you?
Well, obviously I have no final knowledge or say. He is I would take it that he was a extraordinary. Let me back up and say I don't accept the conventional mythic belief that Jesus is the only Son of God. I think Jesus was a remarkable human being, a man of extraordinary personality and intelligence and spiritual capacity, who was deeply realized, had very profound kind of awakening. I can't assess the depth of that awakening, because it's very hard to assess above one's own level, but I don't doubt he had a very deep degree of realization, which probably deeper than his disciples and those who communicated his teaching to us were able to appreciate in full. So we may have got a watered down version. If you read, for example, some of the Gnostic Gospels, you get a much more spiritual view of Jesus as someone who was talked about darkness and enlightenment as opposed to sin and guilt, etc. So for me, I think he was probably a remarkable human being, an extraordinary personality, extraordinary intellect, deeply realized, and extraordinarily committed to his ideals, and willing to die a horrendous death for them, and apparently live out his teaching as remarkably and fully as anyone ever has, be able to forgive those who were torturing and killing him. So my assumption is that he realized the potential and true nature inherent in all of us, and communicated a vision of what reality looks like from that perspective, what relationship looks like from that perspective, a wise way to live from that perspective, and was so inspiring that his realization has echoed through the culture for 2,000 years.
Mm. Roger, as I speak with you, I just get a flash of Helen and Bill. Obviously, they were high-profile academics, and you're certainly one too. But I guess the difference is that they were in the closet about ACIM for a long time, whereas you are clearly not. I guess what I'm trying to ask is, a lot of people are in the closet about ACIM. What is your advice for that? And should we tailor announcing to the world that we are ACIM students? Or, I say that with the understanding that obviously ACIM is to be done in our minds, and we don't need to tell anybody that we're ACIM students. But at the same time, why is there a need to hide something which you are, or something that's so meaningful to you? Wondering, could you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Let's see. My assumption is that it's perfectly appropriate to hold any number of different stances, and that what is important is that we develop what in the Buddhist tradition, we don't have a good course term for this, is called skillful means. In Buddhism, there are two kinds of wisdom that are required. One is the wisdom for realization, to the understanding oneself in reality, but the other is the wisdom of how to most skillfully teach and communicate, and most skillfully be of service to others. That's called skillful means. And it seems to me that there's no one way of living the course, or of no one way to be open about it. And some people will be more out there than others. I've been both. I hid for a long time, and I certainly don't announce this in faculty meetings. I think it's just appropriate to speak according to the person you're with. As the Course says that, it talks about the kinds of relationships. Some people are ready only for a smile, first order relationship. Second is a more enduring one, etc. And, I think the same general principle applies to skillfulness in relationship. Again, a term from Buddhism that I find very useful is skillfulness. An act is considered skillful to the extent that it enhances the well-being of everyone, including oneself, and enhances well-being and reduces suffering. So, is it skillful to tell someone that you're a Course in Miracles student? Will it be helpful to them, helpful to you, helpful to everyone?
Depends.
It depends, yeah. Will it be helpful to tell it to someone who's a rabid atheist and think anyone who has is religious is insane or primitive or retarded or something? Probably not. But it might be very nice to treat them with kindness and love. I remember one Buddhist student who, in the early days when Buddhism was just gaining a foothold here in the West, said, my parents really have trouble with me when I'm a Buddhist, but they love me when I act like a Buddha. So, same thing. It's like, we don't have to announce that we're Course in Miracles students, but hopefully we can be always trying to be look to how we can be as helpful and kind and compassionate as possible in every relationship. And what's appropriate? Well, we ask for guidance. Each situation is different.
Yeah. Roger, we're just going to start wrapping up this interview, but I have one last question for you. And, a lot of the work that I do is to try and facilitate the growth and learning of new ACIM students. What advice and recommendations would you give for new ACIM students on the path?
Let's see. Well, one is go for it. This is a remarkable path and practice that has been extraordinarily valuable to just a lot of people. And if it feels like this would be helpful to you, go for it. And do the lessons each day. Just whatever happens, keep doing the lessons. And then dive into other parts of the course as you're drawn. Another very important thing is see if you can find a course community to touch in with and have that kind of social support. That can be really valuable. When I was writing Essential Spirituality, the 7 Central Practices, looking at what the world's spiritual traditions have to say about what's really important, the thing that surprised me most was that every single tradition said, for every single spiritual quality, if you want to have this, hang out with people who have it. If you want to be loving, hang out with people who love you. If you want to be wise, hang out with wise people. Who's who are your circle of wise people? So for Course in Miracles students, can you find a community to meet and practice with? And then if it's possible, if in your close relationships or intimate relationships, if you can share the Course, it's really wonderful. It just adds a richness to family and intimate relationships that is quite extraordinary. There's something very powerful, first off, about sharing a spiritual practice together, but particularly sharing the Course, which is the only path Frances, my wife, and I have found in any of the world's spiritual traditions, which focuses primarily on relationship as its primary focus and center of activity. So to do it in relationship, and then, and this is something Judy Scutch taught me, is just to appreciate relationship and fostering kind relationships as such an important part of life and the Course. And that was one gift Judy gave me to really, she's a person, as you probably know from me meeting with her, who's just very relationally skilled, and people just love being around her. And for her, it's like the quality of the relationships takes precedence. Until I hung out with Judy and my wife Frances, was like, well, relationships were for getting stuff done. It's like, well, something or other, it's like you came together, you did whatever you did, you had fun, or you got some work done. But to have the idea of having the relationship as primary, and anything that came out of it as secondary, was, for me, was like, it was a 180-degree switch. So, it sounds totally obvious now, but it wasn't obvious to me at the time. So that's another thing. And I guess I would say that it can be really helpful to, if you feel drawn, to add a meditative practice to the Course. The Course has its own contemplative exercises, but it doesn't emphasize a systematic daily meditation practice. And my experience, and that of some others, has been that the two can be wonderfully complementary. That, for example, I begin my day by sitting for 15 minutes and then reading the Course. And I find that if I sit for 15 minutes, then the Course opens up to me, and my mind is a little calmer, a little clearer, a little more open. The Course penetrates deeper, has more impact, is a little more transformative, goes a little deeper. And then, after reading the Course for maybe half an hour, then I'll go back and sit again. And I find that the qualities of what I've been reading in the Course can have greater impact and resonance within the mind as I sit in stillness after reading it. So for myself, I found these just wonderfully, wonderfully complementary. And when I go into meditation retreat, which I try to do frequently, I find that, the Course, I continue to do the daily lesson in the Course, and it just echoes at a deeper level as the mind gets stiller and more sensitive. So that if it feels right, consider doing it along with the contemplative practice.
Mm. Do you encourage supplementary reading other than from the Course? Obviously, this is a very individual thing, but
yeah, I think you gave the answer there, Ken. It's an individual thing, and I think it depends on what people are drawn to and why they're drawn to it. Is it if people feel deeply drawn to read other spiritual materials, it can be wonderfully, wonderfully complementary, and I certainly find that for myself. I just love, finding other profound teachings and trying to open myself to them and looking at the resonances with the Course. If it's just intellectual distraction, then, that's not so helpful. But as with so many things, it depends on the intention.
Yeah.
And, as the Course says, what is it for? It's a good question to ask at the beginning of everything.
It's a very good question. Roger, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Such a pleasure to meet you and speak with you.
Yeah, and Ken, thank you very much for the work you're doing and for for allowing me the opportunity of getting some of these ideas out to a far wider audience than I would reach, and getting ideas from so many other people. It's great that you're effectively going around the world interviewing Course practitioners and students and getting these ideas out there. And it's great that you're using your skill with technology and the internet and so forth to get these people out to such a wide audience. So thank you.
You're welcome. I'm very fulfilled doing what I do.
Yeah, I can imagine.
You've been watching an interview with me, Kenneth Bach. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you got something out of it. My work on YouTube is entirely donation-based. If you'd like to make a financial contribution towards the work that I do in raising the awareness of love, forgiveness, and spirituality on the internet, you can do so by clicking on the link that's popping up right now. It's very fulfilling to be doing the work that I'm doing, and your financial support enables me to make even more videos of a higher quality and with even more teachers. Now, you can also send me feedback and suggestions at my email address, which is ken@acimexplained.com. Now, because of the large amount of feedback that I get through email and Facebook and YouTube, I cannot promise to respond to the mail that I receive. But I can certainly promise you that I will read it, and I certainly do read all of the feedback that I get. So thank you for watching, thank you for listening, bye for now.